My name is Serpinesa. I'm a people of West Indian School. I've been in school only 3 years, but I'm in the 4th grade now.
Do I start now? I am a Pueblo and a graduate of the Albuquerque Indian School. I took my training in the Home Economics Department, and I'm now employed at the Western Navajo Indian School. I am a Pueblo and a graduate of the Albuquerque Indian School. I took my training in the Home Economics Department, and I'm now employed at the Western Navajo Indian School.
John Brown.
Sergo. I'm John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. As promised, I have Dr. Preston McBride joining me for the program to talk about the deaths and the cover-ups of those deaths at U.S. Indian boarding schools. Preston is of Comanche and settler colonialism descent. He lives and works on Tongva lands, where he is a postdoctoral fellow at the USC-Mellon Humanities and the University of the Future program. Prior to being at USC, Dr. McBride earned his PhD in history from UCLA and was the Charles Eastman Postdoctoral Fellow at Dartmouth College. His dissertation and book manuscript evaluate the health, environmental conditions, and the public health policies for the children at 4 U.S. Native American boarding schools. Dr. Preston McBride, welcome to Let's Talk Native.
This project really started looking at cemeteries, and it actually is kind of reminiscent of what's going on now in both Canada and the United States. And I very quickly realized that cemeteries were actually not the best thing to look at, because they only tell a partial story. They tell only the story of those who died at the institutions and were buried there. And so, essentially there's a mismatch between the number of students who died and the number of students who were buried there, because superintendents often sent home, terminally ill children to die at home. So that deflected blame essentially from the institutions. And even with the students who died in federal custody on the school's grounds, there's an underreporting that almost always happens. So Pratt and other Carlisle administrators would write to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs and say, in their annual reports, the health was good this year, and then X number of students died. My research found that realistically, what would often happen is the number of students who died was really their estimate plus some. And that still doesn't even account for those who were sent home to die, which is another huge number of students.
Well, I mean, but let's be honest. The visual that is associated with marked graves is pretty dramatic. I mean, most people can't imagine that you have to have a graveyard associated with a school. I don't think most Americans or Canadians can say, wait, did I have a graveyard where I went to school? Because it's an absurd proposition. So the visual of a graveyard, and again, at Carlisle Indian School, this well-kept, although very small graveyard, I assume by the, compared to what was probably the real loss of life there. It's still pretty, disturbing, and the idea that some of them literally had no names on them. They say unknown or unknown. As it is, let's be honest. The names that are on some of these graves are names that weren't really the kids' names anyway. They were names issued to them as a part of this assimilation system that was at play here.
Sure. It's stunning on a couple levels. On one level, to your point, you're right. How many high schools, these are boarding schools, they're a little different, but like how many high schools in the United States or in Canada, for that matter, have cemeteries? None. Other than Indian boarding schools, high schools, don't have cemeteries. The other thing that's really stunning is that these were children and young adults. So generally, children and young adults are the healthiest demographic of any population. Essentially, the most likely you are to live another year is when you're 11, 12, 13 years old, basically the age of these students.
Well, and that's a great point that you make, because one of the things that happens is there's this tendency to compare the death rates at these schools to what was considered a mortality rate that include infant mortality. So I wanted to make a stronger point on that. When you eliminate this idea of infant mortality from the mix, you realize that the mortality rate at these schools is really even more concerning.
Yeah, when you compare it to kind of what was going on in the United States at the time, it depends on the school and the year, but generally the age-adjusted death rate for white children, young adults, roughly 15 to 24 in the United States, around the time that these institutions are happening, is around 3 per 1,000. Boarding schools, it's between 7 and 10 times that every year. And every year, from 1879 until 1928, there was not a single year where Indian students, at least the institutions that I study, don't die in higher numbers than their white counterparts in the United States.
Well, and I saw that one quote that you had was that the deaths at Carlisle during the census years were higher than entire states that had native populations in them. And this is one school. That's an incredible number.
Yeah, it's really hard to make comparisons because reservation data is notoriously awful, as is boarding school data. To be quite frank. I don't trust the annual report of the superintendents of these institutions, just as I don't necessarily trust the annual report from the Indian agents that were overseeing reservations. And so reservation data is bad, but it also includes things like you said. Number one, children under 5, which are the most likely of any population to die. Under 5 mortality still is higher for today than any other demographic. It also includes the elderly on reservations, and importantly, it includes also the children who were too sick to go to school. So you would expect actually reservation death rates to be higher than boarding schools. But I think the fact that boarding school death rates appear to be higher than reservations is really telling about the institutionalized conditions in these carceral spaces.
Right, exactly. One of the things that's interesting is when I looked at this information that you had gathered about Pratt himself and some of his staff sending kids home to die who were terminally ill. What was really striking about that is it appears that might be part of the in contrast to what happened on the Canadian side, because I think some of what came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is a debacle all by itself on the Canadian side, was that part of the justification and the rationale and the reason that there were graveyards at residential schools is because Canada didn't want to foot the bill to send these kids home, either dead or dying. So, that's even more of a concern. Because especially as I deal with this issue both on the U.S. and the Canadian side, and there's no upside to this thing. And like I said, when I hear somebody like Deb Haaland, you know, giving a quote in the one article that I saw you featured in that says, many Americans may be alarmed to learn that the U.S. also had a history of raising children or of taking children from their families in an effort to eradicate our culture and erase us as a people. I mean, that's a quote from her. And I'm thinking, Canada got the idea. I mean, Canada learned this process from the United States. It's not like, oh, and the United States did some of that too. And she also really avoids the atrocity beyond this idea, again, of sticking the word cultural in front of genocide. Yeah, this was an effort to eradicate our culture. No, it was an effort to eradicate us. And it's not just erase us as a people. When you're talking about the deaths here, I mean, one of the things that I laid out in my previous podcast was those 5 definitions of genocide. I mean, and I've said this before, but it reads like the playbook for some of these residential schools. I mean, all 5 of the criterion established by the international community for genocide took place at these residential schools. I mean, it's incredible.
Every one of them.
Yeah.
I found evidence of students being murdered, shot, by school employees, shot while running away. Anecdotal evidence of students being beat to death by other students at the kind of order of school administrators. I mean, conditions created to, destroy life. That's pretty much exactly what boarding schools were for the vast majority of, their time. They are institutions that basically ran underfunded, institutionalized malnutrition, poor medical care, taking children from their families. Like that is the most basic part of what boarding schools were. So yeah, to your point, all of the kind of constitutive elements of the genocide definition exist in boarding schools. And it was really interesting to see, I'm sure we'll touch on this a little later, but with the TRC and kind of what the United States is doing, it's really tricky when essentially you have a federal government investigating itself, because it sets limitations on this. And so the TRC, the reason why they concluded that it was cultural genocide, it qualified genocide, is because the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement set up this, the TRC body, and basically the TRC commissioners could not reference any law in Canadian judicial circles. So essentially, because genocide was a law in Canada, the commissioners couldn't allege genocide. So they alleged cultural genocide because it's not actually a law in Canada. And the interesting thing about that is 2 of the commissioners came out after the TRC was done and said what happened here was genocide. They didn't qualify their terminology. They only qualified their terminology in the official report that was submitted. And so you see this in the United States too. I think we like to, and I think boarding schools more generally are often talked about in terms of cultural genocide, because at the end of the day, the impetus of these institutions was the destruction of languages, cultures, lifeways, and separating kind of the connection between children, their families, and communities and land. Death was, to me, acceptable collateral damage of that process. It may not have been kind of the idea from the beginning, but death was a part of the system from the beginning. It was lethal year after year, and administrators did very little to remedy those situations.
Well, and when we talk about things like depopulation, there are 2 ways of looking at it, right? There's 2 ways. When depopulation is this nice way of describing killing people, I guess, or allowing people to die, and you have, when you consider some of the sterilization that is documented in some of these schools, you realize that depopulation becomes more than just something that you allow to happen. You essentially make it happen. But the other thing is, we're talking about depopulating an area too. So one of the things that comes out of this residential school thing is the removal of children from their homelands, as if that hadn't already happened once or twice along the way because of trails of tears and stuff like that. but you remove children from a land, which means the land no longer, they could argue that, well, there's not as many people living there anymore. The native people don't need that much land, which we get into obviously the allotment and many of these other policies of reducing the land holdings of native people. But by removing people and then actually severing those ties between the children and their parents that oftentimes would never be reestablished. So, I mean, some of these children wouldn't have families to return to. So even as children aged out of these schools, the idea that they would return home and reestablish lives back there, there's something else involved when we talk about depopulation. It's not just the idea of killing, of abuse, and neglect, the idea of children dying through neglect. There's something more insidious about it when you talk about this plan to reduce our populations on our lands.
I think it's really hard to look at boarding schools in isolation. Any sort of kind of investigation about boarding schools needs to look at the context of federal Indian policy more broadly, both before these institutions were established and afterwards. And to your point, things like forced removals, reservation policies, annuity kind of crisis and withholding rations, fed into conditions on reservations, which fed into why people, parents, communities sent their children to boarding schools. Many boarding school students were orphans, to your point, certainly particular schools. So many,
but they were orphaned. They were orphaned because of policy that had already been established, as you were saying. I mean, the conditions on our territory were so bad that the conditions of life were terrible. But that didn't happen in a vacuum either.
Exactly. I think Indigenous parents a lot of times face the very real threat of starvation. And some of them saw boarding schools as, being promised 3 square meals a day. That sounds, much better than starvation to a lot of people, if that was in fact true, when oftentimes it wasn't. But and
some of that starvation was also a tool. I mean, there were communities that were threatened to have their rations withheld if they didn't forfeit their children to these residential schools. So it wasn't just the idea that you could send your children someplace where they're supposed to be fed. Your own sustenance depended on essentially yielding your children to this policy.
Exactly. And this was codified into law. By Congress. Congress basically said, if Indian parents don't send their children to school, then the Secretary of the Interior, can withhold rations, annuities, and everything else. And so, people did face the very real threat of starvation. And I think, too, to continue with the context, boarding schools also can't be separated from the 60s scoop. And, the adoption era that kind of not only comes after kind of the most deadly period of boarding schools, but also in conjunction with it. Boarding schools in Canada, as you know, last until, different rates, but 1996, there are still, 4 of the 4 schools that I studied in my dissertation, 3 of them are still open to this day in the United States. 2 of them still run by the Bureau of Indian Education. So it's really tricky when you get into timeframes about when Indian education is.
Well, and I know a lot of folks have oftentimes, when I have this conversation, will bring up the documentary Dawnland and what took place in Maine. And I had to remind people that Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Maine was not looking at residential schools as much as it was foster care, which is exactly to your point.
Exactly. And they're very much connected. You can't get around them. Ultimately, the control, guardianship, custodianship of children is important to any culture, any people.
That's why it's listed as a form of genocide, right?
Exactly. And, to your point, kind of you made it the last podcast about, for instance, with UN DRIP and why, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, didn't vote for it. They eventually acceded to it. But it was the same thing with the Genocide Convention when it came out in 1940s. ultimately, the reason why the last clause is in there is because the countries couldn't agree on what the definition of genocide was. And it was only because the governments of Canada, even the United States in particular, and Australia, didn't see at the time what they were doing as genocide. But they tried to limit everything else that they were doing away from the definition. So Lemkin's original definition, the United States and Canada both saw that as threatening, essentially, to what their program of, elimination looked like.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and again, I think when we talk about the idea that you can't look at this stuff in a vacuum, look, we start from this place that the United States and Canada assert the legal right to even take custody of children in the first place. I mean, look, in the United States, it wasn't until 1924 that they would pass a law that would essentially not just grant, but almost force U.S. citizenship upon people. And it is done in many ways unsuccessfully. Now, why do I say that? Well, first, we'll even back up farther. We'll go back to 1868 with the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, which was about granting citizenship to those who were formerly enslaved. You would argue, well, wouldn't that include Native people? Well, the reason it doesn't is because the language in the 14th Amendment says people that the United States had jurisdiction over, which they had never asserted that in 1868. They hadn't asserted that. In 1924, they know that didn't quite get it done because they have to come back 10 years later with the Reorganization Act and try to redefine the status of Native people. And of course, they also add in there at the same time this idea of this Johnson-O'Malley Act, which would further push Native children into being educated off territory into the public school system. Every one of these things you can tie directly to them feeling they had checked boxes along the way through this residential school era.
Yeah, I mean it's ultimately a contestation over sovereignty. Who has the right and who belongs and who doesn't. And the United States sees indigenous people as wards, domestic dependent nations. Emanating from, kind of the Marshall Trilogy, early Supreme Court cases that kind of revolve around Cherokee removal in a lot of ways. And
this is still, there are current white supremacists that are still using, isn't that I think Paul Gosar was one of the I think congressmen or U.S. legislators anyway, that basically, said recently that Native people were wards of the state. I mean, literally still asserting that very, that belief today. I mean, so this isn't just something that, you can attribute to the 19th century. This is, look, we're still fighting these issues today.
You're 100% right. I mean, the battle over sovereignty, Native sovereignty, is something that is continually contested in courts between, the federal government, the Department of the Interior, and Native nations. Especially over things like resources. You can look at kind of national monuments, and one of the things that I found interesting from your last talk is the connection between, restitution, and I know we'll get to this later, and kind of land back and stuff like that. But I was thinking it's also about water back. Depends on where you are. The Chumash just here out in, I live on Tongva lands in what is now the city of Los Angeles. And the Chumash just above us, just submitted through their sovereignty, through the Department of the Interior, a request to take back a huge swath of ocean territory. And these issues about sovereignty, ultimately won't get resolved because, one of the powers believes in this doctrine of discovery, this terra nullius, that's where their supreme authority comes from. Basically, the fact that indigenous people are not humans, that, they didn't use the land, and that the Europeans, Euro-Americans had, justifiable, righteous conquest of the New World. Whereas you can imagine that's not the way indigenous people see it.
Well, and on that note, I mean, when you consider when you look at what these residential schools were doing, it becomes even further justification for this idea that we no longer need to be. I mean, look, the other thing that comes after essentially this era is the termination policy. So yes, we've done a good enough job in this assimilation policy that we no longer have to recognize them at all as a distinct people. And of course, this is where, when we talk about assimilation, and it's one thing when somebody says, look, I want to go someplace, I want to assimilate myself to a culture or whatever else. But when it's forced upon you, that still meets the definition of genocide, because you are essentially, like before Lemkin, you have those who are suggesting this idea of denationalization, this idea of stripping away national character away from somebody and imposing national character upon them is a war crime, and that's 1913 that's being established, not in the 1940s. So, so when I mention and when I say that assimilation is genocide, I know there's even that is going to get some pushback from some folks.
Yeah, I mean, the genocide debate is complex. Some people see it as, a legal category, which it very much is, but it's also an analytical category. According to the legal definition, there's no retroactive prosecution. So essentially, according to UN, nothing before 1948 is genocide, or can be legally defined as genocide.
Not punishable, exactly. As genocide. Yeah, but the problem is what continues after that, and this is where when you're talking about assimilation policies that still exist today. I mean, I have to have a debate with somebody about whether I am a U.S. citizen or not. I mean, I argue that I'm not. That the U.S. Citizenship Act, or the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 cannot be imposed upon me, and I still have the right to claim my nation as my ancestry, my people. I'm Mohawk or Gunyagahaga, and that's enough of an identifier for me. I don't need to be a U.S. citizen or a Canadian citizen or any of those things. And where this becomes problematic, and I actually talked about this at the United Nations a few years ago, over the passport issue. The fact that we are denied the right to travel, and now even across the U.S.-Canadian border, without having travel documents that essentially force us into U.S. or Canadian citizenship for the right of international travel. And I would argue that still should be looked at as a war crime, because it is forcing citizenship upon a people who either don't want it, reject it, or who are having it forced upon them.
Yeah, I mean, this is ultimately about consent. It's also it's again comes back to sovereignty, but consent and, what is forced. And I think it's very clear, especially in the Haudenosaunee case, the Haudenosaunee peoples have been flat out rejecting U.S. citizenship since 1924, and that has remained steadfast, where you have other nations who may see citizenship as beneficial in certain ways, but and that's ultimately the diversity of, Indian country becomes a little bit problematic in this, because there are, you get at this a little bit, not only do you have, hundreds, almost 500 plus federally recognized tribes, 500 plus unfederally recognized tribes. You also have the differences within communities. What does the community itself see? What, the traditional community, what does tribal leaders see? The youth versus, elders. You have all these kind of differences in communities, and we're never going to agree. But I think the vast majority would agree that the vast majority of Indian policy has never been consensual. It's always been forced.
And I think, part of this, even if you look at the language of the Indian Citizenship Act, the qualifier at the end says that nothing in this act should be interpreted as the right to deprive somebody of what they said, tribal property or whatever else, whatever that means. I mean, we can get into a debate about whether the sale of our labor is something that that is conceded with that. So we can talk about things like income tax and that kind of stuff. So we get into tax battles not only at the state level but at the federal level because of a lot of this stuff. So I mean, and I agree with you. There's no question that many native territories, I mean, in fact, I would argue all native territories have experienced levels of assimilation, forced assimilation. And some have accepted some of it. So some of it is not so forced. So we've got churches on our territories and that kind of stuff, which is problematic for many people. But we also, in having to reconcile or deal with things like state jurisdiction in many territories. Look, we fight it as hard as anybody here as Haudenosaunee. Especially when it comes to things like trade and commerce and that kind of stuff. We're going to enter into a whole nother debate because of the recreational use of cannabis and what that's going to mean with dispensaries opening up on native territories, and it's going to be reminiscent of what we went through with tobacco. So we're going to have a lot of those fights going forward. And the reason I think it's so important to revisit things like restoration of not just land, and when I say restoration of land, I do mean water and water rights and that kind of stuff, but autonomy. One of among the things that we lost, and oftentimes, maybe conceded, I guess what you could say, but was so much of our distinction on our autonomy, and that was all part of the plan with residential schools. And so I think it's really important that we understand what took place at these schools. I mean, and when we talk about the abuse and not just the loss of life, and we'll talk a little bit more about that before we wrap up here. But I mean, give me what your research is kind of, I guess, presenting to you as far as you've obviously challenged some of the narratives that have come out of these boarding schools. Everybody wants to talk about things like Jim Thorpe and Pop Warner and stuff like that. But what is your research really showing you?
I think ultimately my research really speaks to the fact that we know so little about these institutions. Even within indigenous communities, and that's purposeful, because it's hidden. But ultimately, these were much more lethal than we ever thought, and it's not even close. To put this in perspective, and it's really tricky, but I don't want to turn indigenous bodies into statistics, but sometimes statistics serve as a comparison to put things in conversation with each other. We think of certain native atrocities. So, you can think of massacres, Wounded Knee, you can think of Trail of Tears and stuff like that.
I always have to pluralize that because it's trails of tears, and
yes.
it happened several times, not just one time.
And again. And some people had multiple, forced relocations, forced removals. If I'm finding that, there are thousands of children and young adults who died in the institutions that I studied.
And just four.
And just four.
Yeah.
And that's not even including all the students who are sent home sick, who I, don't know what happened to them. Although I can presume, because they had tuberculosis or other infectious diseases, that, they likely died very soon after getting home. Many of them died on the way home.
And may have taken some people from their community with them, not to mention.
Exactly. The reports, even the Merriam Report, 1928, recognizes, even earlier than that, 1899, even before the turn of the 20th century, Indian inspectors are recognizing that children are serving as vectors, bringing disease from schools home to their communities. So, if you extrapolate that out, you're looking at a kind of crude deaths in the magnitude of tens of thousands. This is a travesty, a tragedy on kind of par with things like Trail of Tears. This is not just about assimilation. And I think, truth-telling and healing kind of require us to your point, get a full and accurate accounting. These lives mattered then, they matter now. And we have to do kind of our due diligence in telling the most complete story that we can. And while that's hard and, not all people may want that, I think Native communities are recognizing, even those who kind of have taboos around, speaking of the dead, are recognizing the importance of this. Not everybody wants to, dig up bodies and repatriate them home, but some do. Some want, communities want their children, their kin to return home and have a proper kind of, proper ceremonies regarding their transitions to a different world. I think people don't realize how, constellated across the entire United States these schools were. They were everywhere, on reservation, off reservation, most obviously west of the Mississippi because of that context. But, in the East Coast, you still have schools in North Carolina. You have Thomas Indian School. Up in New York, you have schools in Maine. These schools are everywhere. And, I think to Deb Haaland's point in that article is, most people don't know about these. And why don't people know about this? Well, it's hidden history. And, at the end of the day, representatives are beholden to their constituents. And until 1924, and even afterwards, Indians were not constituents.
Well, and I would argue that we still aren't. I mean, this is part of that autonomy. And this is where I get a little concerned with somebody like Deb Haaland, who no longer is serving us. She's serving them. And so this is where some of this stuff gets difficult. I mean, you talked about, on the Canadian side, how much they had to skirt around words like genocide because of what their legal framework allowed. They couldn't be truthful. They're almost bound by their own laws not to be.
Yeah, and I think do I necessarily believe that the federal government is the right institution to investigate itself? No.
Are you even having trouble getting the federal government to avail some of the information, even in some of your work?
This was under previous administrations, but, the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, submitted a bunch of FOIA requests to the Department of the Interior, Bureau of Indian Education, to just find out where records are. The schools that I study, I'm very fortunate that they are, even though records have been destroyed, lost to mold, fires, they generally are held in the same repository. They're in national archives locations across the United States, but in typically one of them. A lot of schools, Genoa, the Genoa Indian School Project just came out yesterday with their kind of death list. They found at least 102 Native students who died at that institution. And Genoa is a school where the records are dispersed all over the country. And that's to say nothing about kind of the institutions run by churches for which we have zero records.
And they kept records though. They're just unavailable.
The missions in California, going all the way back to kind of 1700s, kept very, very, very explicit records of what happened. The government, these records did exist at one point. I don't know if they exist now, but ultimately, NABS wanted to know where the records were, and basically the federal government said, "We're not in." The business of doing research for you. You're on your own. Figure it out. And even to this day, I think the federal government struggles with knowing where the records are that are in its custody. You have boxes in National Archives. They're also underfunded. You have boxes of just random records that haven't even been looked through, for decades and decades, and that are inaccessible to the public or, historians, Native communities. But ultimately, the government does have records of some sort, and we need those, going forward. And, to the current kind of boarding school healing initiative that kind of Deb Haaland has, undertaken at the Interior, is really a fact-finding mission about where the records are. It's not truly an investigation into boarding schools per se. It is let's start this conversation and find where the records are.
Yeah, so it gives you an idea how far into the future any real any conversation about reconciliation can even take place, because we could argue that Canada may have done a commission, but we obviously know that they fell pretty far off the mark when it came to things like quantifying the amount of deaths that took place at these schools. One of the things, and I've made this assertion, and I know that some of the abuses that have taken place at the hands of churches, including the Catholic Church, go back to Europe. But I would argue that the unfettered access that they had to children, the absolute control that they had over children, including, power of attorney and all of this stuff over native children, really gave a breeding ground for what we know today as the clergy sex abuse scandals that are not just rocking the Catholic Church, they're rocking other denominations as well. I would argue that the residential schools added, if not a foundation, but it did add some foundation to this perversion that took place, at the hands of these, these churches.
It's, sexual violence was ever present in these institutions. It's actually something that's really hard to find out about, in part, again, because of, whether the records were destroyed or whether they were ever reported is a separate question.
Well, the church has been covering this stuff up for, off territory amongst, white children as well. So we know that it's going to be a cover-up. Yeah.
I think this is an important point is, you have superintendents who impregnated students. I definitely have, documentation of that.
And I wanted to mention that because, I've heard numerous accounts of babies that were aborted because of these, unplanned, unwanted pregnancies that happened at the hands of staff members, and which is even more absurd when you consider the role the churches have played, the Catholic Church in particular, on their abortion campaign. So, it's not only do you have the children there, but you have young girls who were impregnated by staff members, and those babies not surviving the ordeal either.
Yeah, you also have infanticide. Young Indigenous women did not want to bring up children in that environment. They were afraid, so these things exist. And I think, too, it's really telling that, so in 1976, when the GAO came out with its report about sterilization, if you go further in that same document, you'll notice that they came out with, I think, 3 or 4 separate molestation charges against boarding school officials, not necessarily church related, but just Indian or employees of the Bureau of Indian Affairs assaulting children. And there are hundreds of them. These aren't kind of one-off, two-off cases. These are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases of molestation. Ultimately, these institutions were sites of abuse, physical, emotional, sexual. They were not pleasant places. And the kind of the power dynamics, the hierarchies in them led to teachers, matrons taking advantage of young children.
Who did these kids have to go to?
Powerless in a lot of ways.
Who exactly. Could these kids turn to?
And I think it's really telling. I estimate that fully 1/3 of all boarding school students ran away. That is a ridiculous statistic because ultimately that is kind of the biggest area where Indigenous students had agency. They could run away. They could try to escape. It wasn't always successful, but they tried, and they often tried again and again and again. And they didn't care where they were going. They didn't necessarily want to go home. Well, I'm sure they wanted to go home, but they didn't care where they were going in that moment. They just wanted to get away from the institutions.
And where they ended up may not have been granted any more safety than what they left.
No, in fact, it was incredibly dangerous to run away. I have countless examples of students being run over by trains, falling off horses, dying from exposure, frostbite, losing limbs. Running away was dangerous, especially when you consider, some of these children are young as 4, 5, 6. A 4, 5, 6-year-old running away, even in a group of, older children who may be, 14, 15, 16, is still dangerous.
Yeah. No, it is incredible, and even as we begin to flesh out some of these numbers, the idea of what the cause of deaths were, or causes of death, is going to be a whole nother issue that may never be addressed. So how much of these deaths were abuse over abuse? How much was neglect? How much was again, we talked about the inadequate health care, or the fact that children would oftentimes die of very, very treatable ailments, injuries, or whatever else because of the lack of health care, or the lack of, sufficient health because of malnutrition and that kind of stuff. you really have to blame the deaths on the schools. I mean, so whether we call them murders or not, and of course we also get into this idea of semantics over whether an unmarked grave or a mass grave. I mean, I've even heard Native people say, well, they weren't mass graves, they were unmarked graves. Well, unless you know exactly when these children were buried, and how many at a time, we're just playing semantics here for no good reason.
Yeah, I mean, in the institutions, the vast majority of students die from disease. Yeah. But diseases don't act alone. They are brought about by conditions. And oftentimes what I find, I think this is a big takeaway from my research, is you essentially get frequently recurring epidemics. So in 1889, at Chemawa boarding school, still open to this day in Salem, Oregon, you have a series of kind of 8 epidemics over the period of a year and a half. So where students get measles, then they get mumps, then they get influenza, and then that turns into pneumonia, and then they get tuberculosis, because all of those diseases weaken their immune systems. And tuberculosis is already in the school. It may have activated, an infection, a tubercular infection they already had, or kind of gave them a new tubercular infection, and they ultimately, died in great numbers. Now, diseases, they have some agency. Let's say they act. They're living organisms. They do things in very predictable ways a lot of times. And when you have, bodies that are affected by malnutrition, abuse, they're overworked. These are also forced labor institutions. These children are getting not the care that they need. And under those conditions, diseases thrive. And when you don't, and this is also too, this is an era before antibiotics. The treatment for these diseases, vary. They knew about germ theory at the time. It was kind of medical knowledge, Western medical knowledge is changing. But generally they knew these diseases were infectious. And sometimes they knew how to stop that.
They certainly knew quarantine. Yes.
Yeah. It's very similar to kind of, social distancing that, we're doing today, vaccines. All these students should have been vaccinated for smallpox, for instance, upon coming to the school, which often didn't happen. And there are plenty of smallpox epidemics, well into the 20th century, which most people think of as kind of a colonial, disease. But no, I think you're right to point out. And when I ascribe kind of responsibility for these deaths, the government at the time is saying it's indigenous people. They live in filth, squalor, it's all their fault. In reality, it's like, no, look internally a little bit. It's the conditions of these schools, because every single boarding school student should have been given a medical examination twice, once upon leaving the reservation and once upon getting to the school. And if they were sick, they never should have been admitted, according to, government policy. Now, often that didn't happen. Superintendents are always admitting sick students because they need the money. And when they admit sick students, they're also admitting disease into the school.
I've never heard any numbers associated with Spanish flu and the role of the Spanish flu, since that was such a deadly virus. That alone must have really taken its toll on. And I know there were still many schools in existence still.
Yeah. So I'll preface this by saying the most lethal period in boarding school residential schools is kind of the 1880s through kind of the early 1900s. 1880s and 1890s, extremely lethal, with the exception of the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu, the deaths, shot up. And so Haskell, for instance, Haskell was located just a couple miles away from where the Spanish flu was first kind of documented, at an army base. And the soldiers were often in Lawrence, Kansas, recruiting Haskell students to be soldiers during World War I. So Haskell actually had 2 outbreaks of Spanish flu. They had the first outbreak of Spanish flu in April of 1918, and then the second wave also hit them in October 1918. And so their death rate was actually far in excess of what the Army base was. And I think that's actually a telling comparison. I have to dig up the exact numbers, but generally speaking, and their children. So the Spanish flu typically had a higher death rate amongst kind of teenagers, young adults. And So outside of the early period, the Spanish flu was also the most lethal. But deaths, even though they decline, they still continue. And, this is something that I think is also really important is, Chemoa still again open. They've had 3 deaths at the institution in the 21st century. This is deaths in federal custody still happen.
Well, and I got to wonder, I mean, how much did all this death contribute to this idea of indoctrinating these children into Christian beliefs, and in fact used as to say, well, you obviously are sinners, and you obviously your pagan beliefs are still, I just wonder how much this ends up being used as I mean, I know early on there was a lot of talk about, like with smallpox, that that it was church, it was priests that were going to offer healing to indigenous people. I just wonder how much this death and these illnesses would also play into promoting further assimilation.
You actually raise a really important issue. So basically, at this time period, you have these kind of racialized beliefs about medicine, about health. And so there's, on one hand, this belief that indigenous bodies are inferior genetically to whites. And so during the assimilation era, kind of as these boarding schools are happening, boarding schools are justified on the poor parenting, so-called poor parenting or poor health of indigenous peoples. And it's the savior narrative of we're coming in, we're, taking your children away to save them from themselves, to save them from your parenting, essentially. It's really interesting because schools run into this kind of this catch-22 where they're telling indigenous peoples that, your ways are backwards and you shouldn't do them anymore. Then it comes to tuberculosis. And what's the treatment for tuberculosis at this time? It's open air living. So they're essentially putting boarding school students in teepees and saying, this is the way, you need to treat this disease. And people are saying, well, wait, this is what we've been doing, our entire lives. This is the way we live. And they're like, no, that was bad. This is good. And they couldn't reconcile between those two things. But basically the unhealthy conditions of boarding schools further justified medical intervention into indigenous people's lives. For instance, the BCG vaccine, the vaccine for tuberculosis, is non-consensually tested on indigenous peoples. In Alaska, the Tonawanda, and Arizona, and the Mexico border, medical and the nutrition, also the kind of starvation in Canadian residential schools about, what happens to children's bodies when we don't give them, all the vitamins they need.
It sounds eerily familiar when you consider the, what Nazi Germany was doing.
Yeah, Tuskegee, I think the United States has a long history of questionable ethical, decisions when it comes to non-white people.
Sure. No, absolutely. Well, and again, when we talk about the deaths that occurred there, it's really, really troublesome, and it's really disturbing. But we also have the survivors of these residential schools, and these survivors would be the ones who would be pitted against the United States as further encroachment onto our territories, as further assimilation and further diminishment of our autonomy would happen. So again, I can't escape the effects that residential schools had on the diminishment of both our lands, where we lived, how we lived, and our distinction and autonomy, our sovereignty. And how much it would be diminished as a direct cause of the residential schools.
I think looking at even the kind of disparities, the social disparities, the health disparities, the educational disparities of today are also tied to boarding schools. Diabetes, for instance. Boarding schools change subsistence patterns, change diets, And a lot of the health consequences of malnutrition, for instance, they, documented are multi-generational. It's not just these children are malnourished and the effects end. The children are malnourished and then their children suffer from it.
Yeah, we're not just talking about epigenetics here. We are really talking about the fact that we are creating disabilities that would be literally inherited.
Exactly. This is yes, boarding schools are trauma. Trauma has been shown to be passed on. And that, you're right. Epigenetics. This is something entirely different. This is about multi-generational health impacts of certain, federal policies that continued and affect, nations and communities today. The ongoing effects of boarding schools are still very much with us.
Well, and again, this is really kind of feeding my passion to press for conversations about restoration more so than this idea or this concept of reconciliation. I think we have to, get a better assessment on what transpired not only at these schools but as a result of these schools, and and work that you are doing and others like you are. It's so important in this conversation. I look forward to having more conversations with you, if you don't mind. I mean, it's been enlightening to me. And I know when normally you're giving an interview, you're probably not talking to somebody who has as much background as I do even, so I felt like this has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed you joining me on this program, and I really do look forward to having you join me again. I think that your work is going to be a part of what we have to really include in any conversation as we talk about what this investigation that Haaland is talking about initiating. As you said, this is going to be decades before there's going to be anything meaningful that comes out of this. And I know the tendency is going to be to throw money at it. And we've seen what happens with things like the Cobell suit, where pennies on the dollar are offered as a way to pay off. And that was during the Obama administration, I might add, to pay off the wrongs of the United States. And I just don't think that we can allow this one to get swept under a rug.
Well, yeah, I think, number one, I'm grateful for you having me here and to share this kind of important history. Not everything can be solved by money. I think this is going to take a lot of hard work. It's going to, from scholars, from communities, from the United States, from legislators, and it's going to be all hands on deck.
Yeah, and don't leave activists out of this, because I think we have to have the grassroots people made aware. Because look, we've been kept in the dark to much of what is known as well. Look, we all have family members. We all, you talked about your own personal experience. You're trying to. Getting involved in this research, from your own family ancestry issues. There are many people who know atrocities took place there, but we've never been able to quantify them and quantify the effects of those atrocities. And I think that's why you're right. We can't have the government policing itself on this thing. It just doesn't work. We have to have Native people and look, I think international community should be more involved. It's a shame that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is as toothless as it is. But I think trying to get countries that can look at this thing more objectively than the United States, and frankly more objectively than we can look at it, I think would be a value to us.
Yeah, it's again, it's something that's it's a long time coming. Number one, and it's something that we're a long way from even being in a situation to have any conclusions. Essentially,
but I still think it's
so much more work to be done.
It's really important that as information does come out, that we get it out there, because I think we have to create a bit of a groundswell, I guess, to make sure that this thing is pursued. I've heard a lot of my own people say, the United States has been awfully quiet on this thing, and Deb Haaland makes a statement, writes an essay, and everybody oohs and ahs over it. But what's happening? And even on the Canadian side, until another nation picks up, a firm that comes in there with ground penetrating radar to do another accounting of these unmarked graves, it gets deafeningly silent in between this stuff. And we've got to make sure that we keep this, keep the drumbeat going, I guess.
Yeah. It's 5 years between the TRC and the, uncovering of the unmarked graves in Canada. And more and more work is being done. Like I said, just yesterday, Genoa announced, their, the deaths of that institution. And we just have to keep working at this, trying to keep, telling the truth. And you're right, getting out there. And so again, I think this is, a great opportunity to begin to spread these stories and this history.
Thank you for checking out the show. As always, if you like what you hear, you can support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/letstalknative. You can follow us on Twitter at Let's Talk Native. You can also follow us on Instagram at Let's Talk Native TV, and you can join us on our Facebook group page. I am John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.
War paint to the sunrise, getting braided up as my paint dries. The blood falls from the red sky, my lady singing that war cry. We'll break them up like mannequins, look them in the eyes, they panicking. Draped up in a bear hide, we ain't Indians, we savages. Don't believe me, check my status, this battlefield is my canvas. And it might not take us platinum, but that hand drum is my anthem. We go bang, bang. On the 808s, we coming when you feel the bass. No deal with the devil, no soul to sell. We were red when we broke through the gates of hell. Savages, native to the land you've inhabited, home of the braves and the ancestors who walked the land you damaged. Man, we hail from a side of that atlas that practiced all weaves on baskets, carved masks on cedar plaques as we live by the law of the land. Don't take what you can handle, don't break what you don't understand. Goddamn, we back again, kill the Indian, save the man. Pull a knife from my back and I go berserk. I don't make friends, I make feelings hurt. Ill behaved, man, I'm on my worst, no new friends, I put family first. Underneath the mask, I'm a monster. On my people's back, I'm a conqueror. But before I reconcile, man, I'll add this to my profile. My grandpa was a savage before savage was in style.
Savages, homie, we them savages. That's how they gon' label us. Thanks to all the cameras, we savages, homie, we them savages. Forgotten languages, goddamn, ain't that a bitch? We savages, homie, we them savages. That's just the way we live. So my kids will be some savages.